Thank you very much for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. I've called my talk Theme and Variation, and that's a term, obviously, which is most commonly associated with music. But I want to talk today about theme and variation in relation to natural phenomena and the way in which the study of that natural phenomena and theme and variation has influenced my work as an artist. In a way, the thing I want to talk about is so ubiquitous that we hardly notice it, and yet it drives the universe that we live in. The picture you see on the screen is me, age 6, looking at fossils that were sent to me by the Natural History Museum. It's hard to imagine that happening these days, but I was a keen fossil collector, and I wrote, with my parents' help, to the Natural History Museum for advice about where I might find fossils. And to everybody's amazement, a few weeks later, this incredible box of fossils turned up. I was very dyslexic as a child, which is why I had to have help with the letter. I mean, to such an extent that I couldn't read at all until I was about 12, which meant that my understanding of the world was much more to do with direct observation. I didn't have access to information through reading. This is one of the fossils that I was looking at in that picture, and we're naturally drawn to patterns, to symmetries, to ordering things. We're drawn to flowers and butterflies and spiral shapes, and one very quickly notices that one finds similar kinds of patterns in seemingly very, very different contexts, produced by often diametrically opposite processes. The other thing that I suppose one realizes is that it's almost like there's a kind of pattern book of form, a limited, surprisingly limited pattern book of form, on which all the variations that we see around us are based. We intuitively have a sense of the balance between theme and variation, between order and randomness, and we take a pleasure in that. And in a way, this limited pattern book could be rationalized as driving the evolutionary process itself. If one thinks of spontaneous pattern formation mitigated by random variation, without that, actually, the evolutionary process wouldn't happen. There would just be stasis. Everything would stay the same. If one imagines variation, randomness without the ordering principle, well, it's almost impossible to imagine what that would look like. It would be undifferentiated chaos in many ways. And you see the examples here of the branching patterns of a tree to do with sap being drawn up by evaporation and the river going in the opposite direction. These underlying themes that I'm calling them, or ordering principles, are best understood in terms of geometry. And I suppose geometry, in a sense, is the mathematics is the study of patterns, and geometry is the way in which we can best understand these things. This is the Giant's Causeway, caused by the shrinking of molten magma to create this hexagonal packing. Another example of hexagonal packing, but produced by completely different processes. This is a picture of a bit of hornet's nest from my attic, actually. We see the same hexagonal packing, but the other thing that one notices very quickly is that, of course, neither the Giant's Causeway packing nor the hornet's nest packing are actually geometrically perfect. In fact, one could argue that geometry, pure geometry, only really exists in our imaginations. We extrapolate from many examples to find the archetypal geometric form. The classic example of theme and variation, I suppose, is snowflakes. Because it's so obvious and so awe-inspiring when you look at a whole load of snow, that we know they're all hexagonal, and yet no two are ever the same. And we instinctively understand this relationship, and we take pleasure in it in an emotional as well as an intellectual level. One kind of takes pleasure in that frisson between the kind of dangerous unpredictability of variation and the reassurance of theme, as you can see in these pollen grains, which have very obvious geometry, but at the same time, one can see the very strong variations and differences between each particular example. Of course, variation, by definition, cannot exist as a singularity. The whole point about variation is that you have to have a number of things in order to compare them. And in terms of art, variation implies playfulness and expression. And for that reason, much of my work is built up in sequences. So by comparison between the different examples, which one can see are all related, I mean, we all recognize walnut kernels, but they are very, very different from one another. And by making sequences of drawings where I allow myself to actually go with what they suggest to me, because when you look at them, the more you look at walnut kernels, the more they remind you of other things. And in a sense, one builds up a set of different expressive qualities by that process of comparison, by comparison with their siblings, if you like. The other thing that I think is very powerful for me about something like these walnut kernels is that we seem to respond very strongly to bilateral symmetry, as in Rorschach's famous ink blot test that he developed in 1921, the psychological ink blot test. But I think it's a very simple reason for this. I think because we are ourselves more or less bilaterally symmetrical, we're so attuned to reading expression and meaning into bilateral symmetry. This is another kind of pattern in nature. This is a fascinating pattern that is seen very much in botanical forms, in plant growth. This pine cone is a good example of it, but we see the same in fir cones, in pineapples, in the arrangements of leaves on a plant. It's to do with efficiency. It's to do with efficient packing, and it's a way in the world of botanical form that is actually using geometry through millions of years of evolution to achieve this packing. It's mathematically very interesting and complex. It relates both to the Fibonacci sequence and the golden proportion. And it's also visually very beguiling. We immediately notice, because we're looking for patterns, we notice these kind of opposing spirals, and it's mathematically extremely specific. When I was asked to work on a project at the Eden Project for a new education building, I wanted to make something, rather than to do with variation, more to do with something archetypal. And I thought this particular phenomena, this particular geometric phenomena, which is called spiral phyllotaxis, would be a very, because it's so pervasive in plants, would be a good sort of motif to use. And actually, we designed the roof structure based on this principle. And I made a very large granite sculpture, which sits at the heart of the building, which you can see in the picture there. Interestingly, the phenomena of this pattern, a scientific experiment where electrically charged particles of oil were dropped into a circular kind of Petri dish at regular intervals. They repel one another, and after a while, they naturally produce this extremely complex and very specific pattern. This is another kind of chemical pattern. This is an image, a high magnification image of two chemicals that won't mix. And I became very fascinated looking at these images and looked at lots of them and started to try and analyze what the underlying principles were that determine this pattern. And actually, it comes down to just two very, very simple rules. And you can go on developing that pattern and inventing in a playful way, and the idea of playfulness is very important to me as an artist, without repeating yourself, but still using these same rules. And for me, this kind of pattern and working with this kind of pattern was very much to do with a sort of visual evocation of music, of improvisation in music. I suppose I was thinking of jazz or of Baroque music and all the variations and permutations. The other fascinating, and I decided to make a large piece of work painting on canvas, which you can see there. The other extraordinary thing about this inorganic chemical phenomena is that that many animals, most of the stripy animals we see, and fish, in nature, zebras, tigers, and so on. This chemical phenomena produces those patterns. When the creature is at a very early embryonic stage, these two chemicals are secreted onto its surface, and they lay down a chemical pattern, which later on, with pigmentation, kicks in to produce the kind of camouflage patterns that we see on the mackerel that you can see on the screen behind me. So I wanted to play with that idea, both the musical idea, the improvisational, the playful idea, and the expressive nature of the pattern, and also to allude to that idea of camouflage, because of course those patterns in animals are very often used for camouflage. The piece of work that you see on the screen there is the result of this. It's called Rocks in My Bed, which is after the wonderful Duke Ellington blues number. And in the foreground on the canvas are naturally eroded boulders painted with this same technique, with this same system, so they kind of blend into the background. Another way in which I've worked with the concept of theme and variation is in trying to embrace the idea of chance. Variation implies an element of chance, a sort of how else could it be kind of curiosity. And so I've often chosen ways to work where I choose a random element and a structuring principle and bring those two together in such a way that between the two, I have space to play and invent. Now, naturally eroded boulders are pretty much as near as one could get to random three-dimensional form. They're formed by innumerable chance events over geological timescale back to the beginning of the Earth. So they really are nothing to do with a human being. And in this case, you can see that I'm laying over that a geodesic structure, which is a complete network over the whole surface. And what's interesting to me is the way in which what was just quite an amorphous shape, when it's structured in this way, one is able to perceive the form so much more intensely. It slows your eye down. The increments of the form enable you to see where it's bulging, the individual hexagons and pentagons swell and get bigger. Where it's relatively even and flat, they go into a regular packing, and where it's concave, they all get scrunched up together. Now, this may seem a rather incongruous image to throw in the middle of all this, but of course, exactly the same principle applies to the fishnet tights. They enhance our understanding of the form. They make us see the form more clearly. They give us a sense of where it's pushing and shrinking and so on. And of course, that's why fishnet tights are very good at being able to enhance our appreciation of a leg. This is a group of stones. We're back to stones again, I'm afraid. This is a group of pieces which use that principle. And actually, if you saw those boulders, the thing about this is, of course, I've kind of, strangely as a sculptor with these works, I've kind of relinquished the responsibility of the overall shape. That's become a given. But I'm very interested in what happens while my brain is busy with the puzzle of trying to make the reconciliation between this random lumpen thing, nothing to do with anything human at all, and my structuring principle. Actually, there's a surprising room for unself-conscious play and invention. And for me, making art is all about getting one's head into a space where you can unself-consciously play. So actually what I'm fundamentally interested in is not stones, not clay, not charcoal. I'm interested in what makes us tick. And all the ways that I develop to work are to do with trying to find ways that I can unself-consciously bring that out, rather than illustrating ideas. These ones are, the rule here is just a continuous line, rather as Paul Klee would have said, taking a line for a walk. So it's one continuous line, my own self-imposed discipline. But of course, there are an infinite number of ways that one could traverse a form with a line. So while I'm trying to reconcile the two, I'm also being playful. With these works, I've taken really the diametrically opposite approach. With these pieces, the forms themselves are highly ordered, highly regular. They're like curvaceous versions of the 5 Platonic solids, which are the 5 fundamental regular polyhedra. But the material is utterly chaotic. The material is like gas, or like swirling liquids. And of course, when the material was formed deep in the ground, it was a melange of molten material, which then literally is petrified. And I've kind of rationalized that chaotic thing into something which is very highly ordered, the sort of shapes you see in atomic and molecular structures and crystalline structures, and right the way through, because it's basically the way stuff fits together. It's the it's the laws of physics and the way things fit together in our universe. Back to spirals again. I hope now that you might get a sense of how pervasive this theme and variation is on all scales. And I suppose theme and variation, in a sense, are two sides of the same coin. Theme without variation would be just monotony, endless monotony. Variation without theme would be chaotic and almost unimaginable. But the two combined, the relationship between them produces creativity, both in the natural world and in art. Thank you very much.